Ignition sequence start. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
Hello, and welcome to today's Schriever Spacepower series. I'm Charles Galbraith, Senior Resident Fellow at the Mitchell Institute's Spacepower Advantage Center of Excellence. Space warfighting and the need to achieve space superiority are topics of incredible consequence. Once rarely discussed in public, they are now front and center as essential elements of the Space Force. This is crystal clear in one of the newest documents from the Space Force, Space Warfighting, a Framework for Planners. This framework articulates how the Space Force might approach warfare in space and creates a common lexicon for future discussion. The Space Force recently released a great documentary made by Guardians on why space and the Space Force are so foundational to the success of our nation. Given all of this, we are privileged to have with us today Lieutenant General Shawn Bratton, Deputy Chief of Space Operations for Strategy, Plans, Programs, and Requirements. As the Chief Strategy and Resourcing Officer for the Space Force, Lieutenant General Bratton oversees the strategies, requirements, and budget that will shape the future of America's newest service. General Bratton, it's great to have you with us here at the Schriever Spacepower series once again. Thank you for being with us. Before we dive into questions, do you care to make any opening comments?
Well, Charles, thanks for having me over. First time in the new studio, so I'm excited, and we were able to walk over. So love the new location.
Excellent.
Always glad to come over and talk to Mitchell. And thanks to you and everything you guys do. I'll tell you, there's a lot going on in the Space Force right now. You know, in addition to the warfighting framework, we're eagerly working in the 26 budget, waiting to see what's going to happen with that. We're already well into 27. You know, maybe most importantly, we got a brand new secretary confirmed this week, and so we're excited to get Dr. Mank in the building and have him lead us through the next couple of years. And so, real busy. New doctrine document, lots of activity out there in the field, of course, as you know. And so, happy to talk about any of those things, but really the Space Warfighting Framework is the thing that I'd love to focus on.
Yeah, that's great. There are so many topics that we could dive into, but let's focus a bit on the framework. So it's a framework for planners, and planners can mean a lot of different things to different people. Are we talking about operational planners? Are we talking about future force design planners? What was your target audience for this document?
Yeah, it is interesting because we had a couple of discussions with the boss, with General Saltzman, on, hey, what is this document? Is it a doctrine document? Is it a planning document? We think is it a terms of reference? And we'd had several documents preceded it. In an actual terms of reference document that the CSO put out in his, competitive endurance theory of victory, and so and the space truths, so all these individual pieces were out there, and we're trying to sort of thread them together. How does a Guardian think about warfighting in space? And there were pieces of that scattered in all those documents, and so the intent of this one, this is written for Guardians. It'll get out there, beyond the Space Force for sure, but really written for Guardians to use, to lay a common framework for planning, really a common framework for training and education on how do we think about these concepts of offense and defense and orbital warfare and electronic warfare and cyber warfare, and just to sort of baseline the Space Force in these concepts. So I wouldn't call it a doctrine document. We really do think it is a thing that a planner keeps on their desk and can reference when they're doing work across the Space Force.
That's very helpful. So, target audience of Guardians, but as an unclassified document, it's going to get legs, and the joint community, other services will look at this as well, and so will Mr. and Mrs. America. They can access this and maybe understand a little bit more about why the Space Force exists. These might be secondary and tertiary audiences.
Yeah, I think we're aware of that, and we don't mind the document being out there. It's intentionally unclassified. We don't want to shroud this in secrecy, just like warfare in the air domain or land domain, or none of those are shrouded in secrecy. We understand how the Air Force fights, how the Army fights. We should also understand how the Space Force fights.
Excellent. So let's dive into that. You mentioned this is a great foundation to build for future discussions. So what are some of the key elements of this framework that stand out to you as really guideposts for Guardians? Yeah,
I think part of it is just removing the mystery. I mean, we're more and more comfortable, and you can see the evolution of the language that we use, that you and I grew up with. We used to talk about contested and congested domains. And then we sort of, modified our language, and we would say, it's a competitive space, or we'd say terms like protect and defend.
Right.
Meanwhile, I think across the Joint Force, everyone was very comfortable saying offense and defense. So here's how we conduct warfare in air, land, and sea. And so I think really this is the normalization of the language, and showing the Joint Force that, hey, really warfare in space isn't that different than warfare in the other domains in the concepts that you apply. Offense and defense, use of cyber, electronic warfare, or orbital warfare activities. There's not a big mystery behind all this. We're a warfighting organization just like the other services are, and here's how we do our business.
Yeah. Well, so anytime you create a framework, especially for something as complicated as warfare, there's going to be seams, there's going to be overlap areas as well. So let's dive into a couple of those. One that jumps out to me is you describe orbital warfare, and you also describe electromagnetic spectrum operations. But there's probably an area where those two overlap, where you might have a satellite that could have, at some point in the future, a jamming capability or some other electromagnetic. So how do you articulate, or how do you differentiate these two areas, or how do they work together?
Yeah, I think that's the intent. Part of the intent of the framework is to lay this out there for planners. So, throughout my Air Force career, I learned how do we suppress enemy air defenses, and how we use electromagnetic warfare, how we use kinetic strikes, how we use all the capabilities that the Air Force brings to bear against that problem. The framework doesn't say how to do that. It lays out the considerations for the planners. Hey, you should think about cyber and electromagnetic and orbital strike. You should think about kinetic strike, in the terrestrial space. And so, how do these things come together? That's what the planners got to figure out, depending on the problem set. The framework gives them the tools to be able to address the problem.
Okay, so putting on your old STARCOM hat on once again. So what challenges exist for the training of Guardians when we look at some of the areas like orbital warfare and electromagnetic warfare? These are highly technical fields. So from a training perspective, how do you think this is going to evolve for STARCOM to focus that training for Guardians?
I think it becomes a really helpful document. The Delta One team, Tim Shaba and the whole STARCOM team is after this already, and has done really well. But I can trace. I went to Air Force basic training as an 18-year-old, and I immediately, in basic training, started to learn, here's the aircraft that the Air Force flies. It was F-4s back then. So, and here's what they do. And I had to memorize that, and I took little multiple choice tests. And then throughout my career, I can trace how, through education and training, those concepts were built upon. NCO prep school back in the day, at OTS, in SOS, we're studying Warden's 5 rings and how to apply air power against a center of gravity. But all that built on these fundamental concepts I learned in my most basic training. I think STARCOM does a great job of that today, but this is another tool that will help them expose Guardians to these concepts from day one, and then build upon these concepts as they move through their careers.
Awesome. So the framework outlines several aspects for what they call passive defensive measures, and it talks about hardening and mobility and disaggregation. So hardening is something we've done for years, particularly for our nuclear command and control and communication satellites. Proliferation through disaggregation with the Proliferated Warfighting Space Architecture that the Space Development Agency is fielding. We're moving out there. But there isn't as much on the mobility front. So can you talk a little bit about each of these three and how that might manifest going forward, and maybe where we might need to focus a little extra attention on mobility?
Yeah, and I think there's work to do, across the spectrum here, but in the defensive side, as we use these concepts. Before we generally tried to build everything into a satellite. There wasn't a lot of movement and maneuver, but things like hardening or any protection, protection of the individual spacecraft. I think the framework tries to say, hey, there's a group of capabilities. They may not all be resident on a single satellite. It may be a group of satellites working together through movement and maneuver, through passive defense, through active defense mechanisms to protect the mission, the global mission operations capability that we're providing. And so we have to think about each of these things, the capabilities of all the spacecraft that are in play in this scenario, or whatever the planners are working with, and understand how they can work as a force package instead of I have a single spacecraft. How does it defend itself? Nobody else does business that way.
Right. So there's nobody that's alone and unafraid.
That's right.
We're always working together.
That's right.
And So that's an excellent view of how to approach it for space operations. Thanks for that clarification. So another area of clarification that I'd love to get your insight on, and that's about maneuver and refueling. The document calls for mobility for defensive purposes and has a section dedicated to movement and maneuver. But you've also been quoted as saying that you don't see the clear advantage for the military in refueling yet. And yet the Space Force is also investing in programs like Tetra 5 to demonstrate on-orbit refueling. So there's a lot of different messages out there about how serious is the Space Force about on-orbit refueling and the need for maneuver. Can you help clarify the intent as well as the action that's happening here?
Yeah, I spend a lot of time talking about this, both within the service and then with our teammates over at U.S. Space Command. General James, Tom Lockhart. Space Command usually talks about dynamic space operations, which is much bigger than just refueling. And I am on DSOs. I mean, those concepts of movement and maneuver are built into the concept of dynamic space operations. I think we're trying to understand the value proposition of refueling and sort of the trades that come with it. And so I think it's entirely appropriate, and we are investing in demonstration of capability. We've got some studies going on with some of our teammates who are peeling this apart, both on the cost side as well as sort of the military advantage. And that's really what I'm trying to understand, mostly on my S5 hat, on setting the force design for the service of what's the military advantage of refueling. Is it? It's very clear in the air domain when you refuel the airplane, it extends the range of the aircraft, and that gives advantage because you could reach targets that you otherwise couldn't reach with refueling. It's a different use case on orbit, and mainly we're talking about just out at GEO. And so a spacecraft at GEO, with a refueling capability, you can get more use out of the spacecraft. Maybe I don't think it sometimes it could extend the life of the spacecraft, but I don't think that's the main use case. Right. Usually other components will fail on the spacecraft over time. And so, okay, if that is the advantage that refueling brings, then let's put that into some wargaming, run it through a conflict, and how much of a difference does it make if I go to war with refueling, I go to war without refueling, how do I quantify that advantage? And then we can measure that against the budget choices we got to make. And we're in the sort of middle of that work within the service right now. Because if I'm putting money against refueling architecture, making satellites able to be refueled, I'm taking money from something else to do that. And so I got to be able to lay that out for General Saltzman, and so he and Dr. Mank now can make the choice. But I don't have the data together yet. I think we'll have that this fall, based on the ongoing work, and then based on the great demonstrations that are going on out there with SSC that is sort of helping us figure this out. Hopefully there'll be a futures command in there too that can kind of prove these concepts. That's one of the things I think, we're trying to carry the ball on the service now, but a dedicated command to work these concepts and flesh them out. Same, I'd say the same applies with cislunar. We need someone to really put together the value proposition with this, and then we'll make choices in the service. Okay,
great. So if I could encapsulate that a little bit, dynamic space operations in favor of. There's potentially multiple ways to get at that. That could be refueling. It could also be building satellites that are less expensive and putting up more of them and replenishing that. And it's the mission set that will drive the infrastructure that you need. GSAP, for example, Geosynchronous Space Situational Awareness Program, for example, maneuvers on a regular basis, and you might be able to increase the amount of maneuvers or the degree of maneuvers. That might be a utility, but you wouldn't do it for every satellite.
That's right. And then of those use cases, and GSAP's a great example, is there enough of that out there that it's worth then, now I got to sort out a refueling infrastructure, now I have to defend an on-orbit refueling infrastructure, or do I go to a smaller proliferated GSAP that maybe are lower cost, easier to get on orbit, and I just use a replenishment strategy rather than refueling.
Yeah,
I think there's a place for refueling at some point in the future. Is sort of where I'm landing right now. We'll see how far in the future, I think, is the question. Is it, hey, we need this within 3 years, 5 years, 10-year time horizon?
Yeah. And there's an old expression, right? It's not the years in the life, it's the life in the years. So maybe the analogy for the Space Force is it's not the life in the effect, but it's the effects in the life.
Yeah, I think I gotta make sure I understand what you just said. I think that's true. I think that's very much what U.S. Space Command would say is, hey, we want to get more out of the spacecraft while we're using it and be able to use it more frequently, and refueling is an enabler for that. It may be on the, I got to put my sort of budget hat on and my green eye shade and say, hey, it may be better if I just give you more frequent replenishment and you can use it and then move on to the next, the next launch, the next spacecraft. Also allows for great tech refresh in that model as well.
Sure.
And it may be, I think it clearly is two different strategies for low Earth orbit and then out for GEO.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And mission drives it as well.
That's right.
SATCOM versus GSAP, two different mission sets, two different requirements.
Yeah.
So you talk about budget priorities. Let's talk about offense and defense. Back when there were threats, but our adversaries didn't use space as much, we could focus on defensive capabilities. And so our budgets reflected that in proliferation and disaggregation and things like that. But now we're seeing China have a robust space-based kill web, which drives the need for offense. So how do you, with your green visor budget hat on, how do you balance the offensive and the defensive portfolios within the Space Force?
Yeah, I think we look a lot to the combatant commands first, and what are they demanding, what are they requesting, and they have several mechanisms that they can put a demand signal on the service. And so that informs our thinking a lot. What's General Whiting need? What's Admiral Paparo need? What do all the combatant commanders need? We're also informed by our own service doctrine and how we see this unfolding. We're doing a lot of work right now on understanding the sensor laydown, the TT&C, so the ability to command and control spacecraft, the command and control mechanism, sort of the ground architecture that lets us support both offensive and defensive actions, and making sure we have the ability to do that sort of at speed and scale if called upon. And so there's a lot of work in the S5, led by Colonel Benson and the team, a lot of work on the 8 side with General De Niro and the 8 team to program that. Ultimately, we sort of lay it out in front of the Secretary and the CSO with some choices, and then they steer us.
Yeah. I'm glad you highlighted the infrastructure that supports, because it's so tempting to focus on the end effector. What is the weapon system that achieves an offensive or defensive effect? And it's easy to ignore the domain awareness, the intelligence, the targeting, the command and control, launch even, that has to get you there. All of that is critical to enable that effect from being achieved.
I tell you, I'm like 3 doors down from Greg Gagnon, and he will not let me ignore the intelligence piece. He is in my office. We talk about it all the time. And you're right. We have to build that out. We have to build it out. We always leap to orbital warfare, but we have to build that out for cyberspace warfare, electronic warfare, which is maybe the area we have the most experience in.
Right.
But across the board, they each require different things to make them successful. We got to be able to do it all.
Excellent. So the framework also has leaned forward, I think, further than I've seen recent documents when it comes to space fires. There's even a section in there that talks about terrestrial strike from space, which is kind of exciting to hear about. And then it coincides with Golden Dome's approach of having space-based interceptors to provide missile defense. So older doctrine would have called some of this Space Force application. Back then, you talked about how when we grew up. But is this an area that's much discussion within the Space Force now, or is that still pretty far out in the future?
I think there are kind of two different pieces there. So the terrestrial strike, and really for planners, is, hey, don't forget, we're part of the joint force. There's an Air Force and a Navy, Marine Corps, Army, all out there, and we don't always have to use space to solve a space problem. And we got to tell planners, hey, if someone can drop a bomb on it and destroy the thing that's causing the problem, that's a great way to make the problem go away. And so there's a little bit of a reminder of, don't forget you're part of the joint force. And just like we help the joint force solve their problems as part of them, we need to rely on them, and that's okay to solve some of our space problems and put a demand signal back on. Here's what we need from the Air Force and the Navy and the Army and the Marine Corps. We get a lot of demands from them. And so I think that's a two-way street, and they are on board with that. And I think for our planners who are in joint environments, out there in the component field commands or in a combatant command staff, it's really like, don't forget about this aspect of it. The Golden Dome piece, I mean, that language in the Golden Dome executive order is pretty prescriptive in boost, phase, intercept from space. I mean, each of those words has a lot of meaning, and we've torn them all apart to make sure we understand. But the from space part, I think, puts us front and center, and that's a tough problem to solve, but we're going to figure it out.
Yeah, it is a tough problem to solve. We've been looking at it for decades in different forms. Back on the cross-domain effects to achieve space superiority that you alluded to, where you can drop a bomb on a ground station to achieve a space effect. That's also very good to hear that the community, the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the Marines, they're all thinking about this in the same way.
That's right. That's right.
Excellent. So you brought up cyber operations, and clearly there's a huge linkage between space operations and cyber. There always has been. So how do you approach this overlap between space and cyber operations when it comes to achieving your effects within the Space Warfighting Framework?
Yeah, I think, and I have some background here. My group commander time, we were doing offensive cyber operations, working for 24th Air Force at the time, now 16th. And the synergy you get from space-enabled cyber operations or using space to support cyber, or the other way around, is pretty strong. And U.S. Cyber Command and Space Command, it really moved the ball forward on that. And so we do a lot of sort of combined space and cyber operations, joint operations in that manner. I think we've benefited from our relationship with the Air Force, clearly. They're very strong in this area, and we have very close ties, especially on the sort of the offensive cyber side of the house. But we got to plan this defensive thing. We can't just lock our eyes on the offensive part. And so I think the defensive cyber operations, the work that Spock has done to bring that along in the mission defense teams and how do we defend our architectures is important. We owe them training, we owe them resourcing, the planning tools, all the things that the orbital warfare guys need, the cyber operators need as well. And so I think there's work to do there to understand the capabilities that we're trying to present and then resource it appropriately.
Yeah, and we can't focus just on the offensive side. Like you said, every avenue that's an opportunity for us is also an opportunity for an adversary. And so the defensive side of cyber operations has got to be, we talked about the balance between offensive and defense. Maybe that's even more so on the cyber side for us. Yeah,
I think so. I think it contributes, as we walk through some of those attributes, the resiliency attribute, applies to cyber as well. And we have to be able to operate through conflict. And so having strong defensive teams that can react to, movement on the cyber terrain and move to contact in a defensive manner, just like any of the other services do in their domains. And so good partnership with the Air Force, building out capabilities within Spock. I think the pathfinders that are out there now in the mission defense teams have really moved the ball forward. And so, but there's more to do.
Great. So the Space Warfighting Framework and just acknowledgement that space warfighting is a mission area for the Space Force really expands what we're asking Guardians to do, which has traditionally been support to other domains and support to other services in terms of the effects, global mission operations as we call it today. But this shift to also include space warfighting has got to include a significant element of the organize, train, and equip parts of the Space Force. So what are the next steps for the Space Force and for Guardians when it comes to space warfighting? You've got this framework.
I think we're doing great work, and really I got to give a shout out to the acquisition organizations and to our teammates, Steve Purdy and the SAF SQ. I mean, they are really thinking about this delivery of a fully burdened capability. It's not just the end item, and it's not even just the end item in the training system, like the things that make the end item work. It's the end item, all the .mil PF that goes with it, but also how does it integrate with the system of systems? How does this work with command and control and TT&C and the SDA network for sensors if we're talking orbital warfare? And so specific to your question on the training piece, I think we're doing a better job, and it's really credit to the STARCOM team and Tim Shaban and his crew on understanding the operational test and training infrastructure we need, and really being demanding about the range assets that we need, the test assets that we need, so we can get more training. I think there's movement and more to do in simulation. Really what they need is a little bit of time. I think the resources are flowing. I think they know what they want to do. Now we're just working through the program to deliver. Corey Klopstein out there is the PEO for OTTI, is just killing it. And the same on the range. We've laid a good foundation of, we understand what we want to be able to do test and training. Now we got to go through the acquisition process, deliver those things. And they're moving at speed, but at speed doesn't, we can't expect them to be instantaneous. It still takes a little bit of time to get through.
Yeah. So a part of this warfighting framework is to normalize or put on a common framework or foundation, warfare in space and warfare with other domains. But unlike other domains, where you can say this is where the war is occurring and this is a keep-out zone and it's dedicated to civilian activity. Space, everybody's up there all the time. And so the role of commercial providers and commercial capabilities in space warfighting has got to be something that you're also kind of wrestling with, perhaps?
Yeah, I think interesting on the terrain piece, because we haven't had a fight there yet, and it'd be an interesting diversion on would we ever fight only at LEO or only at GEO? What are the different terrain? Which one would give you advantage? I don't think we see the fight unfolding that way, but I don't know that we've thought a lot about, would there be a constrained fight in space in the same way it's constrained on land? And so I don't know the answer to that. And now I forgot the rest of the question.
Well, it's basically how do we integrate commercial into space warfighting?
Yeah, we're working hard on this. And so, usually in commercial there's sort of a range, because we're not, Guardians aren't building spacecraft. We're always buying them from a commercial company. So that's sort of the traditional commercial model, where we're going to go procure spacecraft and then put them up. And we do that. We've always done that, and we'll continue to do that. Usually when people talk about commercial, they're talking about the commercial as a service. Like we're just going to pay someone to do GPS or orbital warfare or whatever. I think we discuss this a lot with the CSO. I think and I wouldn't say we've settled on what right looks like. The commercial strategy starts to lay out, hey, here's some areas that we are interested in moving commercial that we haven't done before. And here's some areas we think we reserve for military. I mean, warfighting is a military responsibility, period. I think presenting forces to a combatant command, forces are uniform members. Now, can those forces be supported by commercial? Absolutely. I think that happens in all the services. Sure. But the force that's presented is a squadron, a delta, a combat detachment of the Space Force. And so finding the right balance in there. I think Steve Purdy's really got a handle on this. And a lot of his recent sort of acquisition decision memorandums coming out are really pushing us to, hey, no, we can do both of these things. We can take advantage of the speed that commercial offers, but it will be a guardian operating the system in the warfighting side of the house. In the global mission operations, well, I think that's where we're really thinking this through on, well, they could be in the warfighting environment. You could find yourself in the middle of the fight.
Right.
It goes back to the defensive part. I have to take defensive actions. Are we comfortable relying on a commercial vendor to do that? Does it need to be a guardian in charge of the defensive actions? Is there a mix of both? And I think the answer is probably the latter. There are some areas where we can move more into commercial for sure.
Yeah, but like you talked about earlier, in the defense of a satellite, no satellite's going to be alone and unafraid. Right. It's all going to be part of an architecture of interlaying effects.
Yeah, and I think some of the early work that really back in the Air Force Space Command day, but that still carried through into the Space Force with commercial integration cell, helps us solve that operational, how do we work as a team to defend it, if we were defending a commercial asset. I think the framework for that is in place out at Vandenberg, with Doug Shess and the team. And so we just got to build on that, and then we got to keep increasing our understanding through wargaming and sort of concept development.
Yeah. Let's talk about the international play in space warfighting. The United States has always, gone to war as a coalition. There's incredible strength and value in that approach. And certainly there's a strong deterrent message in having a coalition or a partnership of nations confronting a challenge. How do you look at the international piece with space warfighting? What would you like allies to bring? What do you think are areas that we absolutely have to do?
Yeah, I think I think the allies are developing capabilities across the spectrum, and I think there's a willingness for them to go into offensive operations, go into defensive operations, electromagnetic. I mean, the whole spectrum I think is out there, depending on who you're talking to. I think we have to be prepared to operate with them, and we certainly want them to bring capabilities to the fight. And so, if an allied country makes the decision to build an offensive capability, we got to fly and fight with those guys, just like we do in air, land, and sea. If they're building a defensive capability, and we understand that, then maybe I can shift my money into something else that we need and rely on the allies for defense. And so, I think there's a lot of room here. I think the mechanisms, whether it's the Olympic Defender team or the CSPO team, there's mechanisms in place now with our allies where we have these discussions. And then ultimately, each country has to decide what's right for them. But it goes back to your kind of recurring theme on training, on education, making sure we understand how to operate. So when the balloon goes up, that we're there together.
Yeah, and U.S. Space Command integrates all those and achieves the effects they need. Excellent. Okay, so I can't have the Chief of Resources for the Space Force here and not ask a couple budget questions. Yeah. And I know this is a dynamic time for sure. We're under a year-long CR. The next year's budget is still kind of in development. You said you're working on 27 already as well, so there's a lot going on the budget front. I don't think there's a member of our audience that would disagree with this statement. The Space Force doesn't have enough resources to do what it needs to do right now. But how much growth should we be looking to the Space Force to get, and how quickly? General Saltzman was here back at the end of March. He said we could use an additional $10 billion right now. That's on top of the roughly $30 billion. There's also been recent calls for a quarter of the defense budget to go to the Space Force because it's that critical. I'm concerned about how much you could actually ingest at once and execute given the small size of the service. Certainly you need to grow, but what's the right sort of framework that we should be thinking about when we're talking about frameworks for budget growth?
Yeah, I think, and you know this, today we're 3.5% of the DoD budget. Yeah. A quarter would be a lot more. That I hadn't heard that number, so that's a big number.
It is.
I think here's what we've done, and a couple things. One, that the DoD, Office of Secretary of Defense, issues defense planning guidance. It sort of tells us, here's the things we expect the Space Force to be able to do. Here's some areas where we can take risk. And we costed that out. And to do all the things that the department is telling the Space Force that they expect us to do, it about doubles our budget. Now, that's an overtime thing, I think, although quite honestly, they're asking us to do it today. I think we've laid out a pretty good case, and with a lot of space superiority, because remember that the warfighting stuff is new kit that didn't exist.
Right.
And we've tried to stop doing some of the old stuff and been told, pretty directly, you will keep doing missile warning, SATCOM,
right,
position, navigation, and timing. You have to keep doing these old missions. So, that this new mission requires new money. And I think we have a pretty good story that we've been telling on here are the things we need to accomplish, sort of what's laid out in space warfighting. And here's how they fit together in the big picture for the joint force. Here's how we protect the joint force from space-enabled attack. So we really have a handle on exactly what we need. I think General Saltzman's number feels about right for the right now time frame. Yeah. And if you were to look at sort of the list, it's probably in that ballpark. I think there's more to do after that for sure, but I'm sort of eagerly awaiting to see the 26 budget and how it shakes out for us.
But just to do what the Department of Defense, what the nation is asking the Space Force to do now is going to be a doubling of the budget.
That's right. And so, again, we're 3.5% of the DoD budget today. If we doubled, I'm assuming, and maybe no one else changed, that would move us to 7. But the other services have needs too that they're articulating.
Sure. But that doesn't necessarily include, that analysis doesn't include Golden Dome and what requirements might be levied on the Space Force as a result of that, because that's still in development.
That's right.
And it also doesn't include things like cislunar, which we know China's been active in. And
or refueling.
Or all these other things, right?
These are the choices. I mean, there's always more mission to do, especially from the budget standpoint. There's always more mission than budget. And making these prioritized choices. The President's made it clear that we're doing Golden Dome, and we salute smartly and execute that. And so, Golden Dome priorities are high. There is some overlap, and I think we'll benefit from Golden Dome. Some of the work that we've done in the space superiority area, Golden Dome will benefit from, and I think space superiority will benefit from the future work Golden Dome. A space-based interceptor for boost phase, that the technology to do that, we'll be able to use that in other areas. And so there's a lot of overlap in this. So I don't think Golden Dome is a brand new giant build that's coming. I do expect, and I think Congress is working, there'll be some Golden Dome stuff in 26, but we'll see how that plays out.
Excellent. Well, I appreciate the insight and the discussion. This has been wonderful. I think we'll go ahead and open up for audience Q&A. So I think everybody understands the way we do this here. Please unmute your mic and state your name and affiliation before you ask your question. You can also submit your questions via the chat function in Zoom. So Aiden, who's up first for our first question here for General Bratton?
We have Chris Gordon from Air and Space Forces magazine.
Go ahead, Chris.
Thanks, Charles, and thank you, sir, for doing this. You touched on this point just now, but I want to dig a little deeper into it. How are you working on ensuring the Joint Force understands your capabilities and priorities now and in the future, aside from just changing your language to be a little more plain spoken, so to speak? Every service has its concept of a future force, but that only works if you're on the same page. You want to ensure you're properly budgeted, but that only works if the Space Force is properly understood. So what are you doing specifically to that end? Are there specific plans, specific war games, specific documents coming out that will sort of better tell your message broadly inside the department?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things going on that have really, really influenced this. One is the establishment of the service components. And so we now have a Space Force footprint out at INDOPACOM, out at EUCOM, in several of them. And we're building out the rest of the service components over time. That puts Guardians just right in the hallways with Indo-Pacific Command and understanding what the combatant command needs from the Space Force. And so the work that really the Navy has done, for example, Indo-Pacific Command has been translated right over to General Mastelier and the Space Force component out there. And that comes right back to the service. And so we now sort of, for the first time, have a direct line into the combatant commands, and we're getting the demand signal out of them. Now, they demand things in other ways too, through JUONs and through their IPLs and unfunded priority lists and things like that. And so we're able to see the demand signal and understand what does the Joint Force need from the Space Force. We're also able to, by the way, to kind of give that back. What does the Space Force need from the rest of the Joint Force? And so that's opened up a whole new sort of insight and understanding. At the same time, I think we have done a lot of work with the Navy and the Air Force specifically, and now the Army, on understanding that some of the newer capabilities the Space Force is going to bring, and how do they think about that, and how does that interact in sort of their scheme of maneuver or their warfighting concepts. In some cases, they're articulating clearly, hey, they have a dependency on the Space Force to accomplish our space superiority mission in order for the Navy or the Air Force, for example, to accomplish their desired end states in their mission. So a lot of communication. I think the biggest piece is probably the service components that I'd point to.
And so Chris also asked about war games or exercises. How are we at the point where we're integrating into joint exercises and joint war games space warfare without it just being a white card that is assumed this happened?
Yeah, we're better than we used to be. That, again, I'll go back to how old you and I are and when we grew up, how we do it. I don't think we're quite to the point of a ton of live fly activities that you'd see. That goes back to STARCOM and the OTTI infrastructure that we're building out. Yeah. Now, there is a little bit more of that activity. It's not zero. There are some live fly activities that are associated with major exercises in the combatant commands. And then, the fact that General Master Lear is at INDOPACOM, when they're working through Pacific Century and the planning for that really puts a Space Force voice into that exercise, both for us to identify exercise objectives that we need to train Guardians, as well as understand how we fit in the broader INDOPACOM ecosystem.
Great, thanks for that explanation. Aiden, who's up next?
Next, we have Courtney Albin.
Go ahead, Courtney.
Hi, yes, thanks for taking my question. General Bratton, I was wondering if you could give us an update on the Space Force's planning for this future space-based AMTI capability. The commander of NORTHCOM said this week that there are AMTI prototypes on orbit now. Can you tell us anything about, how long they've been there, how many there are, and what you're learning that will, inform this planning for that future, layered architecture?
Yeah, hey Courtney, great to hear your voice. Always good to talk to you. We're doing a lot of work both with the Air Force and with NORTHCOM, as well as the broader Golden Dome team on space. We call it space-based sensing and targeting, but that's inclusive of things like AMTI, GMTI, and so there are some demonstration activities going on. Is about as much as I'd say right now. We're waiting to kind of gather data and understand, hey, how good is this capability from space? How is it compatible with the existing AMTI capabilities that the Navy and the Air Force fly? We think there are kind of synergies of having both flavors of this capability right now, but we're really waiting for some just hard engineering data to understand what we can see from space and how good is that going to be.
So the MTI effort is a partnership with the Space Force and the National Reconnaissance Office, as I understand, the program office is, for the development of that space-based layer.
That's right, for one of the particular capabilities.
That's right,
absolutely right.
And now with Dr. Mink coming in as the Secretary of the Air Force, he obviously has some unique experience and association with the National Reconnaissance Office and now the Department of the Air Force. So maybe we'll see some additional movement.
Yeah, I think his experience and what really the NRO led on very much, applying that to, if we develop a space-based AMTI capability is going to be invaluable to us. So yeah, we're thrilled for many reasons, but that's one that's going to help us a lot.
Excellent. Aiden, who's up next?
Next, we have a written-in question from David Hansen. He asks, can you comment on how we are resourcing Space Force bases to help make them more resilient? Is this a Space Force build to help weapon systems infrastructure woes on our bases? Or is this a joint Space Force Air Force venture? Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's Colonel Hansen out there, he lived through that personally. So, yeah, I'd say a couple things. One, we're taking, that comes up to us through Space Operations Command, through Space Systems Command, depending on which base you're talking about, as you know. And so the field commands are the voice of that. General Burt and the ops team have done a lot to understand the readiness tie between the installation and the operational unit. That we can report readiness about two SOPs flying GPS out of Schriever, but they're dependent on the installation Schriever for power and all the things they need. And so General Burt's really made a big move in capturing that as a readiness reporting item. So it increases the visibility. Hey, if there's power problems at Schriever, that impacts readiness across several operational squadrons. But ultimately, the demand signal for dollars, which is what Hansen's asking about, really comes from General Miller, General Garan. And so we're paying close attention to those. I think we prioritize those high, especially if General Burt is pointing out the readiness impact. Maybe we're able to understand that better than we have in the past. So it's a long way of saying they're ranking higher on the priority list than they have in the past.
Yeah, so it also brings up an interesting aspect of the Space Force. As a small, lean service, there are Space Force bases, but you still rely on Air Force personnel to conduct many of the missions. So civil engineering, legal, medical, et cetera, security forces, those are all still Air Force personnel.
That's right. I think the Space Force was designed to just be an operational organization primarily and lean, a little bit modeled like the Marine Corps. There's things that the Marine Corps depends upon the Navy for. The Space Force is dependent upon the Air Force for many of the functions like you walk through.
Yeah.
The warfighting piece, we got entirely within the service though, and we're going to take care of that business.
Excellent. Thanks. Aiden?
Next, we have Teresa Hitchens from Breaking Defense.
Go ahead, Teresa.
Hi, General Bratton. Thank you for doing this. My question goes back to the terrestrial strike issue. In the chart, in the framework where you talk about counterspace capabilities, you list under terrestrial strike space-based fires. And I'm wondering if that refers to going beyond space-based interceptors for missiles, but actually striking targets on the ground, such as old concepts like rods from God. Does that say that Guardians should be considering those kinds of options when they go forward with planning, et cetera? Thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks, Teresa, and great to hear your voice too. It feels like I'm a regular with you guys. I'd say, hey, part of it is this. Hey, we need to think about terrestrial fires and demand signal for, if a B-21 can drop a bomb on a space target that the adversary has in the terrestrial realm, planners should account for that. I think this, Golden Dome does open a new era as we think about this boost phase intercept from space. I don't think we're going further than that at this time on thinking about any specific capabilities, but it really is just to remind planners, like don't lock yourself into just the space domain. Sometimes the best way to solve that threat or defeat the threat that you're facing within the space domain is going to be there by solving that problem in the terrestrial domain.
So appreciate that, and definitely the need to integrate cross-domain effects to achieve both joint force and space equities. But I think her question was, are we looking at fires from space, on-orbit assets to attack terrestrial targets? And again, this framework is not a prescription. It's just an outline or a framework of what could be done.
Yeah, I think, I'd go back to the Golden Dome exemplar because we're directed to look exactly at that. I mean, boost phase intercept from space, by definition of those words is, hey, I'm on orbit and I'm going to re-enter and impact during the boost phase, which is suborbital. And so that there's some technological challenges there that we haven't faced before, at least in the Space Force's existence, that we're now going to get after because the president said go do it. So we got to figure out how to develop that capability and field it.
Yeah, and we shouldn't forget about the adversary here either. China and Russia could also do these sorts of things. And there's nothing holding them back necessarily. In fact, they've already demonstrated fractional orbit bombardment capabilities. And so we have to be mindful of what they could do to us and how we might need to defend against those.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. Aiden?
Next, we have Shelley Mesh from Inside Defense.
Go ahead, Shelley.
Hi, thank you. I wanted to ask a little bit more about Golden Dome and probably a two-part kind of question. First, could you talk about understanding that a budget hasn't come out yet for FY26, but how much has the Golden Dome initiative changed what you're looking at for the budget compared to the FY25 request? And then also, could you talk to us a little bit about what kind of structure you have within the Pentagon to be talking about Golden Dome, since it does cross so many domains and offices?
Yeah, I think, hey, Shelley, good to hear you again as well. So I think I'll answer the second part first. We're waiting on the structure. I know the services have provided up to the Secretary of Defense level kind of our inputs, mostly capability focused. And at the OSD level, there is a discussion going on what's the structure needed to make sure that we can do all these things. Is there going to be a Golden Dome czar, like I've seen reporting on? That discussion is happening with the Secretary of Defense and ultimately with the President. And so we're waiting for the President to give us our marching orders on how he wants to see this done, and then we'll go execute. I think it certainly makes sense to me that there would be sort of an overarching organizer of the effort because it does touch across the services. On the budget piece, the executive order absolutely impacted the 26 budget, at least what the service put into it. We had direction from the president to go to, and so we immediately started laying that in. There's a lot of things that we still have to figure out. So did we get everything right in 26? Certainly we didn't. Did we understand some of the capabilities that we need for sensing for Golden Dome, for that initial work on boost phase intercept from space? Absolutely. And we did none of that in a vacuum. We were there talking to the other services, talking to Northcom and Spacecom, and for the Space Force, talking to MDA a lot, because they bring a lot of expertise to this. And so, that informed all of it. At the center of it was CAPE and OMB helping sort of organize all the pieces. I still haven't seen the final product. I'm excited to see how the budget lands, and certainly there'll be big flavor of Golden Dome within it.
Yeah. National air and missile defense is a monumental challenge, and it's going to require the amalgamation of multiple systems from all of the services probably. And so I 100% agree with the need for a central lead, a czar, whatever you want to call it, to orchestrate these activities. You and I both also have been through the Combined Joint All-Domain Command and Control
That's right.
joy. And it seemed like each service was developing their component of it, but none of them really worked together to create that truly joint architecture. And we want to make sure that Golden Dome doesn't suffer that same challenge. And so
yeah, that's right. I think I think there's a lot of smart work that went into it. Tons more work. We're nowhere near done, but I think the initial proposal from the services up to OSD was solid. We know the OSD staff secretary took that and made it better, and we're just waiting to now close the loop with the White House and hear our direction from the president to go execute, and we'll get after it.
Yeah, great. Aiden, I think we have time for a couple more questions.
I know my
Next,
wife's
we have a
out
question
there,
from Sarah Miller. She asks, so we expect a top line increase in some way for FY26 and hopefully FY25. Can you talk about the associated end strength that might be needed to go along with that volume of mission increase?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. Really smart. The Space Force needs to continue to grow military end strength for sure to do these new missions. Like I say, we're not offloading any of the old missions, and so we got to pick up some. So I would expect military manpower growth in the Space Force to be able to deliver this. At the same time, we're working hard to understand, hey, what is every single human in the Space Force doing? Where are the Guardians? Are there efficiencies? Are there things where we can go to commercial and better leverage commercial to reduce our requirements? And so the Deputy Secretary of Defense actually has us looking at that pretty closely right now, both in scrubbing the books and then identifying requirements for these new missions. So that work is ongoing. The Space Force is still in the progress of standing up. We're 5 years old, but we're not to that end state yet. And so I think there's always this sense that we would continue to grow over these next few years. And I guess I would expect that to continue.
So that's a great point, that 5 years old, you were on already a glide slope up for increasing your manpower and your personnel on both the officer, enlisted, and civilian fronts. But when you add additional mission requirements on top of what the original plan was, that's going to incur additional manpower growth as well.
Yeah, I think that, and just the completion of the creation of the service, and so there's only 10,000 military, 9,800 in the service right now. I mean, it's a tiny organization compared to the other services and percentage-wise of the DoD. And when I talk growth, it's not tens of thousands. It's hundreds per year. Is kind of part of it is what can the training pipeline actually absorb to enable us to grow at a sort of reasonable rate to meet new mission requirements. And so all this new kit is going to take someone to operate it. It goes back to that presentation of forces. We're going to present Guardians to combatant commands. But at the same time, if we can leverage commercial and create some savings there, absolutely we would do that.
Excellent. Yeah. Aiden, who's up next?
Next, we have a question from Mark Green with One Brief. He asks, what priority is the Space Force placing on software tools that enable real-time integration of space component commands in the planning of operations, e.g. Space Force INDOPAC and support to U.S. INDOPACOM?
Yeah, that's a great question, pretty broad, but we are investing in command and control tools specifically for the component commands, both to execute current responsibilities And then really within the Space Warfighting Framework, hey, how does that communication work between S4S and U.S. Space Command, the other component commands, putting the demand signal for their space superiority needs? And so command and control tools, I think we have a pretty good handle on that, and there's investment in that. I don't know that that solves all the needs of the component field commands. You know, in their little joint operations centers that they might have, does General Mastelier, General Middleton have the tools he need? I'm sure the answer today is no, as we build those, you know, from scratch as well. And so there's probably more work to do there in situational awareness for those forward commanders. We continue to resource the National Space Defense Center and the CSPOC out at Vandenberg, you know, pretty well, and we're trying to meet Doug Shess's demands at S4S in support of U.S. Space Command. So there's sort of a broad spectrum of things there. As we identify and the data shows us this is the key tool, we're putting money against that, but there's probably still some gaps that we need to close.
Great. Aiden, who's up next?
Next, we have a question from Peter Hughes. He asks, is there a construct that the U.S. Space Force has put forth that allows other services to procure and coordinate their own commercial space product purchases, be it imagery, SATCOM, etc.? Or are we thinking that each service should just go out and buy what they want individually to suit their own needs?
Yeah, we're not thinking the latter. I don't think we would have each service, you know, I don't mean to be directive to them in this way, but I think it's the Space Force's job to present space capabilities. What I would think would happen is if the Army component in Indo-Pacific Command needed additional SATCOM, a commercial space capability, regardless of what it was, they would go to the space component and say, here's what I need for you. Space component might say, hey, we already have that. We have it through military means, or nope, we're going to go get it. And then they reach back to the commercial space office at SSC to procure that. I think TAC SRT is a great example of this, where there's a demand signal out of the command. It comes through the service component right there to COMSO and the front door team at SSC, and they go get the answer to that. And so I think in the end, you know, if you need something from space, you should turn to the Space Force, the space component, to deliver that for you.
Great answer. Thank you. Aiden, who's up next?
We have one last question from Major Chris Hune, who's a DAF fellow over at Georgetown. His question is, with regards to future requirements, have there been any considerations for how we go about integrating emerging technologies such as AI onboard satellites? This may enable new concepts of operations such as autonomous defense of satellites, and we're seeing a lot of commercial companies starting to tap into this field for other applications such as space-based intelligence and space situational awareness.
That's right. I think commercial's leading us on this for sure, but remember, we're not building our own satellites, so we're benefiting from that in some ways. I think there are in the S&T side of the house, within the labs, AFRL in particular, but also others are trying to understand the benefit of this, specifically in the warfighting aspect, on how much can you rely on autonomy, and we rely on autonomy a lot in space, but how much can you actually rely on AI? I think this for us is no different than the other domains in understanding the role of AI in warfighting. Where do we draw boundaries for that today, and then how do those boundaries change over time as we understand better what that capability brings? It's sort of the same as the refueling thing. What's the military utility? Making sure we understand that, and then proving the difference of the concept in wargaming. For us, you know, if Space Futures stands up, I think this is a great thing that we would look to Futures to tell us, hey, here's how we can incorporate this. But we're not waiting for that. I know the program office's acquisition team is out there looking at these things today.
I really appreciate that insight. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the end of this Schriever Space Power series. Thank you again, General Bratton, for taking the time to chat with us today and give us your insight. And thank you, the audience, for the outstanding questions that you provided today as well. And so from all of us here at MI Space, have a great Space Power Day. General Bratton, great.
Thanks. Good to see you.